Dave Mustaine showed up drunk, smashed a custom guitar, and blew up $1 million deal. Tom Araya watched it all happen, and never forgot. From backstage tension to decades of silence, Araya has quietly kept his distance. But why? What did he see that made him and so many others refuse to work with Mustaine again? This isn't just old drama. It's a story of rage, betrayal, and a meltdown that changed thrash metal forever. And only now are the real details finally coming to light. Thrash royalty: how Slayer and Megadeth changed metal forever. In the world of metal, few figures are as respected as Tom Araya, or as divisive as Dave Mustaine. One helped build Slayer, a band whose music has been described as pure controlled chaos. The other, after being kicked out of Metallica, turned rejection into rage and founded Megadeth, a band built to be faster, louder, and more technical than anything else on the scene. But what happens when these two worlds collide? Why did so many rockers, Araya included, choose to distance themselves from Mustaine? And what exactly happened that made even some of metal's most intense personalities say, "I'm not working with that guy"? Slayer began in Huntington Park, California, in 1981. It wasn't a band built in garages for fun. It was born in a scene filled with raw energy, distortion, and the kind of sound that parents hated and teenagers worshipped. At the core of Slayer's identity was Tom Araya. He was more than the frontman. He was the calm eye at the center of a violent sonic storm. As the band's bassist and vocalist, Araya brought a thunderous presence to the stage. His bass lines were aggressive but controlled. His vocals weren't just screams, they were declarations. And while his bandmates, like Jeff Hanneman and Kerry King, shredded through fast, technical guitar riffs, Araya gave Slayer a backbone. Offstage, he was surprisingly grounded. He even worked as a respiratory therapist during Slayer's early years, treating patients during the day and playing packed clubs at night. That balance made him one of the more composed figures in a genre known for extremes. Around the same time, in another corner of California, a very different story was unfolding. Dave Mustaine, a gifted but volatile guitarist, had just been fired from Metallica. He didn't take it well. After being dismissed for his drug use, alcohol abuse, and unpredictable behavior, Mustaine boarded a bus from New York to California, furious, humiliated, and determined to prove a point. That anger would become the foundation of Megadeth. Founded in 1983, Megadeth wasn't just another thrash band. It was Mustaine's weapon. He didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to be faster, heavier, and more technically proficient than Metallica, and everyone else. And for a while, he was. Songs like Mechanics and Peace Cells showcased a level of precision and aggression that pushed the genre's limits. Mustaine was an innovator, but he was also unpredictable, and that would become a problem. Thrash metal in the 1980s wasn't just a genre, it was a movement. A brutal, loud, unpolished movement of bands who respected each other, toured together, and competed without tearing each other down. Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax were the big four, for a reason. They didn't just define the sound, they defined the culture. These bands frequently shared bills, influences, and even producers. They built something bigger than themselves. When one of them released a groundbreaking album, the others paid attention. When one of them went on tour, the others watched closely. For all their aggression on stage, off stage there was a sense of unity. But even in a scene filled with wild stories and backstage chaos, Dave Mustaine stood out. His musicianship was never in question. He was one of the most technically gifted guitarists in metal. But his reputation for erratic behavior, substance issues, and ego-driven conflict made him difficult to work with. And while some musicians quietly kept their distance, others, like Tom Araya, had no choice but to face him head-on. That's what makes this story different. Araya wasn't just another musician avoiding drama. He was part of a near-historic collaboration that blew up in spectacular fashion. A studio meeting in 1986 could have changed the course of thrash metal forever. Instead, it ended in smashed guitars, shouted insults, and a bitter divide that lasted decades. The day everything exploded. A recent revelation has blown the lid off one of metal's darkest behind-the-scenes moments. After nearly 40 years of silence, new details have surfaced about the day Dave Mustaine stormed into a Los Angeles studio drunk, insulted Slayer to their faces, and smashed Kerry King's custom guitar into pieces. This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't some exaggerated story from the road. It actually happened, and it destroyed what could have been the biggest collaboration in thrash metal history. How did things spiral so badly? And why did this single outburst make Tom Araya, and so many others, cut ties with Mustaine for good? In the final months of 1986, executives at Combat Records and Def Jam Recordings, the labels behind Megadeth and Slayer, had started putting together an idea that seemed almost too good to be true: a split EP and co-headlining tour featuring both bands. These weren't just two acts from the same scene. Slayer and Megadeth were at the forefront of a sound that was changing everything. Slayer's Rain in Blood, produced by Rick Rubin and released just weeks earlier, had sent shockwaves through the industry with its sheer speed and brutality. At the same time, Megadeth had dropped Peace Sells, But Who's Buying?, an album that showcased Mustaine's technical genius and sardonic songwriting. Both bands were peaking. Both had loyal and growing fanbases. A joint project seemed inevitable, and it would have been a major commercial win, too. This wasn't just a creative idea, it was a business decision with serious backing. Labels had already arranged a meeting at a Los Angeles studio. On paper, the meeting was a formality: get the band members in one room, iron out some logistics, maybe get them to agree on which tracks would go where on the EP. Everyone expected a quick discussion, maybe a few minor creative clashes, and a handshake at the end. What they got instead was chaos. Slayer's lineup arrived at the studio as scheduled. Tom Araya, Kerry King, Jeff Hanneman, and Dave Lombardo were all there on time, along with label reps and engineers. Even David Ellefson, Megadeth's bassist and co-founder, showed up promptly, apologetically explaining that Mustaine was running a little late but on his way. That was around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. As the minutes turned to hours, frustration started building. No one knew exactly where Mustaine was, and his phone was either off or going unanswered. Studio time isn't cheap, and it was quickly being wasted. Finally, sometime after 4 o'clock, 3 hours late, Dave Mustaine stumbled through the door. Multiple witnesses later confirmed that he was clearly intoxicated. Some said he smelled like whiskey. Others said his eyes were bloodshot and unfocused. Whatever the case, it didn't take long for the tension in the room to spike. According to those present, Mustaine interrupted conversations, made rambling comments, and without invitation, launched into a critique of Slayer's Rain in Blood. He allegedly mocked the album's production quality and accused Rick Rubin of glossing over Slayer's raw energy. The irony was not lost on the room. Mustaine was criticizing one of the most iconic metal records of all time while barely able to stand up straight. At first, Slayer's members tried to ignore him. But things escalated quickly. Kerry King, never one to hold back, fired back with a cutting comment. Witnesses recall him saying something like, "At least we can play our songs live without screwing them up." That hit a nerve. Mustaine, whose pride in his playing ability bordered on obsessive, snapped. What followed is still debated in terms of the exact sequence, but the main points are clear. Mustaine spotted Kerry King's custom BC Rich Warlock guitar resting on its stand. This wasn't a regular instrument, it was a custom-built, jagged beast of a guitar that had been modified specifically for King's playing style. It was worth several $1,000s and had become part of his on-stage persona. Without warning, Mustaine grabbed it, shouted something, no one agrees on the exact words, and smashed it against a nearby amplifier. The neck cracked. The body splintered. Pieces of the guitar scattered across the studio floor. For a moment, the room fell dead silent. The only sounds were the soft thuds of the broken guitar hitting the floor. And then everything exploded. Kerry King lunged at Mustaine, but Dave Lombardo and Jeff Hanneman stepped in to hold him back. Tom Araya, often the most measured presence in Slayer, got between them and tried to calm the situation. Ellefson stood frozen, clearly mortified. The label reps quickly took control. Within minutes, the meeting was called off, and Mustaine was escorted out. What was supposed to be the launch of a creative partnership turned into a disaster that would echo for decades. The fallout was immediate. The joint EP? Cancelled. The co-headlining tour? Cancelled. Any future collaboration between Slayer and Megadeth was off the table. But it didn't stop there. Def Jam and Combat Records both suffered losses from the collapsed project. Lost studio time, lost momentum, and most importantly, lost trust. Industry insiders later estimated that the failed collaboration cost somewhere between $2 and $3 million in potential revenue, massive for the 1980s metal scene. Rick Rubin, the producer behind Rain in Blood and one of the biggest names in music production, reportedly swore he'd never work with Mustaine again. Other bands in the thrash scene began taking notice. Megadeth's reputation, already shaky due to Mustaine's past with Metallica, took another hit. Promoters grew wary. Some began requiring deposits or extra guarantees before booking Megadeth. Word spread fast. Working with Mustaine meant risking the show, the deal, or your gear. For Slayer, the incident reinforced what they already suspected. While they respected Mustaine's talent, they now saw him as unstable. Tom Araya would later recount the story in a now-famous interview saying, "It wasn't even about the guitar. It was the disrespect, to Carrie, to all of us, to the people who set up that meeting. That's what couldn't be fixed." His words weren't angry. They were disappointed. And in many ways, that disappointment says more than any insult ever could. The incident created a rift not just between Slayer and Megadeth, but within the wider thrash community. When the Clash of the Titans tour came around in the early 1990s, a massive event featuring Anthrax, Slayer, and Megadeth, Slayer and Megadeth shared the stage, but not much else. Backstage, they kept their distance. Publicly, they downplayed the friction, but insiders knew the truth: the wounds from 1986 had never fully healed. Even now, nearly 40 years later, the studio confrontation remains one of the most infamous behind-the-scenes blow-ups in heavy metal history. And thanks to recent interviews and resurfaced accounts from people who were there, we're finally getting a clearer picture of what really happened that day, and why Tom Araya, along with so many others, made the decision to never fully trust Dave Mustaine again. Tom Araya's perspective, candid insights. In the world of thrash metal, Tom Araya has always stood apart, not just for his voice or stage presence, but for his quiet, measured control in an environment full of chaos. While his bandmates in Slayer thrashed their instruments with furious intensity, and other frontmen of the genre spun in and out of controversy, Araya remained largely above the noise. He rarely courted drama. He wasn't interested in clashing egos or throwing verbal punches in interviews. So when someone like Tom Araya finally speaks up, especially about another major figure like Dave Mustaine, it carries weight. Why did Araya, a man respected for his calm and professionalism, publicly say he felt the need to keep his guard up around Mustaine? And what exactly did he witness behind the scenes that most fans never saw? In interviews over the past 2 decades, Araya has offered only fragments of commentary about Mustaine, choosing his words carefully. But even those fragments reveal a consistent thread. He doesn't trash talk. He doesn't make sweeping accusations. Instead, he points out a pattern. One of his most telling quotes came during a backstage interview at a European festival in the mid-2000s. When asked about his relationship with Mustaine and the possibility of working with him again, Araya replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "He comes across as a nice guy, but I always keep my guard up around him." That line stuck. It wasn't a dramatic outburst. It was something colder, an honest admission of distrust from someone who rarely lets his emotions show in public. And that wasn't an isolated moment. Over the years, Araya has subtly referenced Mustaine's reputation for starting drama, then trying to walk it back once the damage is done. In one instance, he pointed out how Mustaine would often make inflammatory statements in interviews, attacking former bandmates, rival bands, or even collaborators, and then, when the backlash hit, issue vague apologies or claim he'd been misquoted. "It's like a cycle," Araya said in a quiet conversation caught on camera in 2010. Say something crazy, stir everything up, then say you didn't mean it. And repeat. Araya wasn't laughing when he said it. There was no mockery in his tone, just fatigue, the kind that builds up over years of seeing the same thing happen again and again. One of the defining moments that shaped Araya's perception of Mustaine came during the 1991 Clash of the Titans tour. On the surface, it was one of the biggest metal events of the decade. The North American leg featured Slayer, Megadeth, Anthrax, and Alice in Chains, all performing to packed venues filled with thousands of diehard fans. But behind the scenes, the atmosphere was far from harmonious. Multiple people involved in the tour have since confirmed that tensions were high from the very beginning. Mustaine, riding high on Megadeth's commercial momentum after Rust in Peace, reportedly came into the tour with a chip on his shoulder. He had long-standing personal grievances with members of Metallica and Anthrax, and his relationship with Slayer was already damaged by the infamous 1986 studio incident. Even so, everyone involved tried to maintain professionalism, for the sake of the fans, the tour, and the business. But it didn't take long for cracks to show. Araya later recounted how interactions with Mustaine during that tour were consistently awkward. At one show, Mustaine reportedly made a backstage comment about Slayer, always sounding the same, and implied they were coasting on image rather than evolving musically. It wasn't a direct confrontation, but word got back to Araya and the rest of Slayer's crew. Rather than escalate, Araya chose not to engage. He avoided Mustaine off stage and kept their interactions to brief, polite exchanges. According to crew members, there were days when Araya and Mustaine didn't speak at all, despite being booked on the same buses, stages, and green rooms. On stage, the bands maintained appearances. But Araya would later reflect that the energy wasn't the same when Megadeth was on the bill. It felt like there was always a shadow, he once said. Like there was something unresolved hanging in the air, and we were all pretending not to notice it. For Araya, that wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unsustainable. He wasn't interested in building a fake friendship just to make fans believe the scene was unified. And while he never made any dramatic public breaks, his actions spoke louder than words. Slayer didn't work with Megadeth again for years. But Araya's perspective wasn't just about personal discomfort. It was also about observing how others in the metal community responded to Mustaine. In interviews over the years, Araya has hinted at conversations with other bands that quietly turned down opportunities to tour or collaborate with Megadeth, not because of the music, but because of the instability they associated with Mustaine. People notice things, he said. They remember how you treat others, how you handle pressure, how you show up, or don't show up. This sentiment echoed something many in the industry have said off the record. Working with Mustaine can be high reward, but also high risk. He brings talent, technical skill, and name recognition. But he also brings unpredictability. And for professionals like Araya, that kind of volatility simply isn't worth the stress. Interestingly, Araya has never denied Mustaine's musical genius. In fact, he's praised it on more than one occasion, calling him one of the most driven guitarists I've ever seen. But the praise always comes with a qualifier. In a 2018 interview, when asked directly if he respected Mustaine, Araya paused, then said, "I respect his work. I respect his journey. But respect doesn't always mean trust." That distinction matters. It shows that Araya can separate art from artist, but that doesn't mean he wants to work with someone who makes the process harder than it needs to be. Even decades after the height of their professional overlap, Araya's stance remains consistent. In private moments, he's reportedly told friends and collaborators that he harbors no ill will toward Mustaine, but that he's not someone I'd go out of my way to see. That's a polite way of saying the relationship, whatever it once was or could have been, is done. Not in anger, but in quiet finality. Why does this matter now? Because as more and more fans revisit the history of thrash metal and try to understand the dynamics between its founding figures, Araya's perspective offers a rare glimpse into the behind-the-scenes reality. He's not the loudest voice. He's not writing memoirs filled with rage or going on rants in interviews. But his words, when they come, reveal a lot. They tell us what kind of behavior is remembered, even after decades. They show us how professionalism isn't just about showing up, it's about being someone people want to work with. And maybe most importantly, Araya reminds us that in a genre known for chaos, sometimes the most powerful statement is to quietly walk away from the noise. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Click the next video for more exciting content.